The Winterlands offered no mercy, only wind sharp enough to cut bone. Isolde stumbled through the skeletal trees, each step a negotiation with legs that threatened to buckle. 22 years old and already a ghost. Her light blonde hair hung in frozen tangles, her threadbare cloak doing nothing against the predatory cold. 3 weeks of wandering had carved her down to something barely recognizable as wolfkind. She was an omega without a pack. The delicate girl with the ethereal face that made others uncomfortable. Too fragile, they said. A liability. Every pack she'd approached had turned her away with the same pitying looks, the same whispered concerns. She won't survive the winter. Why waste resources? Isolde had come to believe them. She was nobody, a beautiful mistake of nature, too breakable for this brutal world. The whimper cut through the wind like a knife. Isolde froze mid-step. Every instinct honed by weeks of solitary survival screamed at her to move, to run, to not look. But something else, that quiet, nurturing sense that had always defined her, felt the terror in that sound. Felt the pain. She pushed through the frost-laden brush, and her breath caught. A white wolf cub, no bigger than her forearm, dragged a mangled hind leg across blood-stained snow. 3 massive rogues circled him, drool hanging from scarred muzzles, playing with their prey like cats with a dying mouse. The cub's crystal blue eyes found hers, wide with agony, pleading. A tiny, sacred life. 3 monsters built for killing. And Isolde, who could barely defend herself from the cold. How could she possibly survive this? The Borderlands were a graveyard of ambition. This was where the Alpha King's iron rule met the lawless wild, where rogues and exiles carved out brutal existences in the spaces between order and chaos. Lucian Blackthorn's fortress loomed somewhere beyond the northern ridges, a shadow of absolute power that even the most vicious predators feared to challenge. But here, in these frozen forests, his law was only a whisper. Survival belonged to the strong, the vicious, the fast. Isolde was none of these things. She had always been the kind of beautiful that made people uncomfortable, too pale, too delicate, like something carved from moonlight that might shatter if touched too roughly. Her bones felt hollow, her muscles thin and graceful rather than powerful. While other wolves her age trained to fight, to hunt, to prove their worth through blood and dominance, Isolde had learned to make herself small. To apologize for existing. To accept that she would never be enough. The cold didn't care about her ethereal features or her gentle nature. It bit through her torn clothing with ruthless efficiency, turning her fingers numb and her lips blue. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, she'd found nothing but frozen berries in 2 days. Her legs shook with every step, threatening to give out entirely. She needed shelter. She needed warmth. She needed to survive one more night. That's when she heard it. The sound was so faint she almost missed it beneath the howling wind. A soft, broken whimper that spoke of agony and terror. Isolde's feet stopped moving before her mind could process why. Her heart, that treacherous thing that had always felt too much, lurched painfully in her chest. Keep walking. This isn't your fight. You can't help anyone. But her feet refused to listen. They carried her forward, through the skeletal branches that clawed at her cloak, toward the source of the desperate sound. The forest opened into a small clearing where the snow lay pristine and white, except for the spreading pool of crimson at its center. The cub was impossibly small, impossibly white against the blood-stained ground. His hind leg bent at an unnatural angle, and when he tried to crawl away from the 3 rogues stalking him, he could only drag himself in pitiful circles. The rogues laughed, actual, cruel laughter, as they watched him struggle. Isolde's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She had no weapons. No strength. No chance. But the cub's eyes found hers, blue as glacier ice, filled with the kind of terror that only the truly helpless know. And Isolde stepped forward anyway. Leave him alone. Her voice cracked on the words, high and desperate, but it carried across the clearing. 3 massive heads swung toward her in unison. The rogues were enormous, easily twice her size, their coats matted with filth and old blood, their eyes yellow with madness and hunger. The largest one, a brute with a torn ear, smiled. Actually smiled, revealing teeth designed to tear flesh from bone. "Well, well," he rasped, his voice like gravel scraping metal. "Looks like dinner just got more interesting." Isolde's hand shook as she grabbed a fallen branch from the snow. It was pitiful, barely thicker than her wrist, already half-rotted. But it was all she had. I said leave him alone. They rushed her. The first impact drove all the air from her lungs. The Tornir rogue slammed into her chest like a battering ram, and suddenly Isolde was airborne, weightless for one terrible moment before her back hit a tree trunk with a sickening crack. Pain exploded through her spine, her ribs, her skull. The branch flew from her nerveless fingers. "Get up! Get up! Get up!" She dragged herself to her knees just as claws raked across her shoulder, shredding through her cloak and the thin dress beneath. Fire traced lines down her arm, hot blood soaking through the fabric. Isolde screamed, stumbled, fell. The snow beneath her turned pink, then red. "Not much fight in this one," another rogue laughed, circling her like a shark. But Isolde wasn't trying to fight them. She was crawling, dragging her broken body across the blood-stained ground toward the cub, who whimpered and tried to crawl toward her in return. Their eyes met. His were glazed with pain but still aware, still there. "I've got you," Isolde whispered, even as teeth sank into her calf and dragged her backward. She kicked wildly, felt her boot connect with something soft, heard a grunt. The grip released for just a moment, long enough for her to lunge forward and wrap her arms around the small white body. The cub was warm against her chest. Trembling. Alive. "You want him?" Isolde gasped, her voice breaking. "You go through me." They did. Teeth found her back, her arms, her legs. Claws opened her skin like paper. Isolde curled tighter around the cub, making herself his shield, taking every bite meant for him. The pain became everything, a white-hot symphony that drowned out thought, drowned out fear, drowned out everything except the fragile heartbeat pressed against her own. Just a little longer. Just hold on a little longer. The world began to fade at the edges, darkness creeping in like frost across glass. Then she heard it. A sound like thunder, like the earth itself splitting open. The Alpha King had arrived. Lucian Blackthorn moved through the forest like vengeance given form. His armor caught the dying light, black steel plates etched with silver runes of protection and power, designed not for ceremony but for war. The metal didn't gleam, it devoured light, made him a shadow with edges sharp enough to cut. His presence alone changed the temperature of the air, made the wind itself seem to hold its breath. This was a man who had conquered territories, crushed rebellions, built an empire on the bones of those foolish enough to challenge him. The rogues realized their mistake too late. The Tornir brute barely had time to turn before Lucian's blade took his head clean off his shoulders. The body hit the ground in two pieces, blood spraying across pristine snow in a crimson arc. The second rogue lunged, snarling. Lucian caught him mid-leap by the throat, his gauntleted hand crushing windpipe and spine with a single squeeze. The crack echoed through the clearing like a rifle shot. The third tried to run. Lucian's blade found his spine before he'd made it 3 steps. The rogue collapsed, twitched once, and went still. 7 seconds. 3 rogues. 0 mercy. The Alpha King stood amid the carnage, breathing steady and controlled, his dark eyes scanning the clearing for additional threats. His warriors emerged from the tree line behind him, 6 elite guards in similar armor, their hands on their weapons. But Lucian barely registered their presence. Because he smelled it. Blood. Fresh and copper-sweet, far too much of it. And underneath, something else. Something that made his wolf surge forward with a possessive snarl that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with mine. His gaze dropped to the crumpled form in the center of the massacre. She was impossibly small, impossibly broken. Her light blonde hair was matted with blood and dirt, her pale skin torn open in a dozen places, her threadbare clothes shredded beyond recognition. She should have been dead. By all rights, she should have been nothing but scattered pieces for the crows. But she wasn't. She was curled around his nephew, the young prince who had been stolen from the castle 3 days ago. Her arms locked around the cub's white fur with the kind of desperate strength that only comes from absolute conviction. Even unconscious, even dying, she refused to let go. Lucian's breath caught. The mate bond slammed into him like a physical blow, a golden thread snapping taut between his chest and hers, undeniable and absolute. His wolf howled in recognition, in fury that she was hurt, in desperate need to protect what was his. He crossed the clearing in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside her, armor clanking against frozen ground. Somebody, he commanded, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion, survived this. Get me a healer. Now. Isolde woke to silk. Her fingers registered the texture before her eyes could focus, smooth, expensive, impossibly soft against skin that remembered only rough wool and frozen ground. Panic flooded her system immediately. She tried to sit up and her body screamed in protest, every muscle a symphony of agony. Bandages wrapped her torso, her arms, her legs. The scent of healing salves filled her nose, sharp and medicinal. Where was she? Where was the cub? Her vision cleared slowly, revealing a chamber that could only belong to someone powerful. Stone walls hung with tapestries depicting wolves in battle. A fireplace large enough to stand in, flames crackling with steady warmth. Furniture carved from dark wood, each piece worth more than she'd seen in her entire life. And the bed, gods, the bed was massive, draped in furs and silks the color of midnight. This wasn't a healing house. This was someone's personal chamber. The Alpha King. The realization hit her like ice water. She'd heard the stories, everyone had. Lucian Blackthorn, the Iron King, who'd unified the Northern Territories through blood and ruthless strategy. Who showed no mercy to his enemies. Who took what he wanted and crushed anyone who stood in his way. And she'd been brought to his fortress. To his bedroom. Terror gave her strength that shouldn't have existed. Isolde dragged herself off the bed, biting down on a scream as her wounds tore open, fresh blood seeping through the bandages. She couldn't stay here. Whatever he wanted with her, a toy, a servant, something worse, she wouldn't make it easy. Her legs buckled the moment her feet hit the stone floor, but she crawled, clawing her way toward the darkest corner of the room, behind a massive wardrobe where the firelight didn't reach. She made herself as small as possible, drew her knees to her chest despite the agony, and tried to control her ragged breathing. If she was quiet enough, small enough, maybe he wouldn't notice her. Maybe she could disappear into the shadows like she'd learned to do her whole life. The door opened with a heavy creak. Footsteps, measured, confident, terrifying in their certainty. They stopped just inside the threshold. A long silence stretched, broken only by the crackling fire and Isolde's hammering heart. "You're awake." His voice was deep, controlled, but she heard something underneath it she couldn't identify. "And you've torn your stitches." Isolde pressed herself harder against the wall, as if she could merge with the stone itself. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, thin and frightened. "Please. I'll leave. I won't cause trouble. Just let me go." Another pause, heavier than the first. "You think I brought you here to hurt you?" Lucian took a step forward, intending to approach the terrified Omega huddled in the shadows of his own chamber. He made it exactly 3 feet before they appeared. The white wolves materialized between him and Isolde like smoke given form. 5 massive spectral beings whose fur seemed to absorb and reflect moonlight simultaneously, even indoors. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly blue fire, ancient and knowing. These were not ordinary wolves. They were the guardians of the throne, spirits bound to the Blackthorn bloodline for 1,000 years, protectors of the crown and arbiters of the wild magic that ran through these mountains. They answered only to him. They were his extensions of his power, his authority made manifest. And they were blocking his path. Snarling at him. "Stand down," Lucian commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that had never failed him before. The largest white wolf, Fenris, the eldest, lowered his head and growled deeper, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor. The others flanked him, creating an impenetrable wall between the Alpha King and the frightened girl in the corner. Lucian's warriors, who had followed him to check on their king, froze in the doorway. Their faces reflected what Lucian himself felt, complete and utter shock. This was impossible. The White Wolves had never defied him. Not once in his entire reign. "What are you doing?" he demanded, but even as he spoke, understanding began to dawn. The wolves weren't defying him out of rebellion. Their ears weren't pinned back in aggression toward their king. Their bodies weren't called to attack. They were guarding. Protecting. Every instinct they possessed, every ounce of ancient magic that flowed through their spectral forms, had recognized something in the broken Omega that superseded even their bond to the throne. They saw her as sacred. Lucian's gaze shifted past the wolves to Isolde, who had pressed herself so far into the corner she seemed to be trying to phase through solid stone. Her pale face was streaked with tears, her bandages already blooming red with fresh blood. She looked like a rabbit caught in a snare, certain of its death. And the wild magic itself had claimed her as worthy of protection. "She saved the prince," one of his warriors whispered from the doorway, his voice thick with awe. "The spirits know. They always know." Lucian slowly lowered himself to one knee, making himself smaller, less threatening. The White Wolves watched him with those burning blue eyes but didn't advance. Fenris's growl quieted to a low rumble, a warning, not a threat. "I'm not going to hurt you," Lucian said quietly, speaking past his own guardians to the girl they'd chosen to defend. "You're safe here. I swear it on my crown, on my life, on everything I am. You're safe." It took 3 hours before the White Wolves allowed him to approach. 3 hours of Lucian sitting motionless on the stone floor of his own chamber, waiting with the kind of patience he'd never shown another living soul. His warriors had long since retreated, uncomfortable witnessing their invincible king rendered powerless by his own guardians. The fire burned low. The fortress settled into night silence. Finally, Fenris stepped aside. Lucian rose slowly, carefully, and crossed the space between them with the deliberate movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. Isolde had stopped crying, but her eyes tracked him with wild terror, her body coiled so tight he thought she might shatter from the tension alone. He knelt before her corner. Not close enough to touch, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough that she could see his face clearly in the firelight. Close enough that she could see him set aside the crown, the authority, the iron reputation. "My name is Lucian," he said quietly, as if they were meeting for the first time. As if he hadn't already claimed her in his heart. "The cub you saved, his name is Kieran. He's my nephew. The heir to the Blackthorn throne." Isolde's breath hitched. Her voice came out raw, broken. Did he? "He's alive. Because of you." Lucian's jaw tightened. 3 days ago, rogues infiltrated the castle and stole him. We've been hunting them since. If you hadn't. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Unable to voice what would have happened if this fragile girl hadn't stepped between death and his bloodline. "I didn't know," Isolde whispered. I couldn't let them hurt him. I know. And he did. He'd seen her in that clearing, seen what she'd sacrificed without hesitation, without thought for reward or recognition. "You're bleeding again. Will you let me help you?" She shook her head frantically, pressing harder against the wall. "Please." The word felt foreign on his tongue. How long since he'd asked rather than commanded? "I won't hurt you. I just want to tend your wounds." Something in his voice, some quality of genuine care, made her hesitate. Lucian reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew clean bandages, a pot of salve. He set them on the floor between them like an offering. "I'm going to come closer now," he warned softly. "If you want me to stop, just say so." He moved with aching slowness, giving her every chance to refuse. When she didn't bolt, didn't scream, he carefully reached for her arm. His hands that had broken necks and crushed skulls, were impossibly gentle as they unwrapped blooded bandages and cleaned wounds with a healer's precision. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "For saving him. For being brave when no one else was there." Isolde's tears started again, but this time they looked different. This time, they looked like relief. 2 weeks passed before Isolde could walk without pain lancing through her ribs. The fortress was full of warriors, both male and female, who moved through the halls with lethal grace and unshakable confidence. Isolde watched them during meals in the Great Hall, these powerful women with their scarred knuckles and weapons worn comfortably at their hips. They laughed loudly, wrestled playfully, commanded respect without ever having to ask for it. They belonged here in a way Isolde never could. She'd seen how they looked at her, not with cruelty, but with polite confusion. What was this fragile, ethereal creature doing in the Alpha King's fortress? Why did the spectral wolves follow her through corridors, their glowing eyes watching her every move? Why did the king himself check on her daily, his dark gaze intense with something that made her heart race and her stomach twist with emotion she didn't understand? Gratitude. It had to be gratitude. She'd saved his heir. Of course he felt obligated to care for her until she healed. But she was healed now. And she needed to leave before she became a burden. Isolde packed nothing because she had nothing to pack. She simply slipped out before dawn, when the fortress was quietest, when even the guards were changing shifts. The borderlands were dangerous, but they were no more dangerous than staying somewhere she didn't belong, somewhere that reminded her daily of everything she wasn't. She made it to the tree line before a hand caught her wrist. Lucian spun her around, his face a storm of confusion and something that looked dangerously like panic. He was breathing hard, he'd run after her, the Alpha King had run, and he wasn't wearing his armor, just a simple shirt and breeches that made him look less like a warlord and more like a man. "Where are you going?" His voice was rough, demanding. "I can't stay." Isolde tried to pull her wrist free but his grip, though gentle, was unbreakable. "You've been kind, but I don't belong here. I'm not like them. I'm not strong. I'm not a warrior. I'm just mine." The word cut through her spiral like a blade. Isolde's breath caught. "You're my mate, Isolde." Lucian's other hand came up to cup her face with devastating tenderness. "Do you think I care that you can't fight? You stood against 3 rogues to save my blood. You have more courage than any warrior I've ever known." His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "The bond snapped into place the moment I saw you in that clearing. You're not a guest here. You're not a debt to be repaid." His forehead pressed against hers, his voice dropping to a whisper that held the weight of absolute truth. "You're my queen. And I'm claiming you as my own." The Great Hall blazed with celebration. Prince Kieran, fully healed and energetic as any young wolf should be, darted between tables while the pack roared with laughter and raised their cups in endless toasts. Musicians played drums and strings in the corner, the rhythm wild and primal. Lucian sat at the high table with Isolde beside him, his hand resting possessively on her thigh, his eyes warm in a way his warriors still couldn't quite reconcile with the Iron King they knew. Isolde wore a gown of deep forest green, the first truly beautiful thing she'd ever owned. The female warriors had helped her dress, their initial wariness melting into something like sisterhood when they realized she wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't competing for status or power. She was simply herself. But even amid the joy, old instincts die hard. Isolde had spent years staying alive by being invisible, by reading rooms and sensing danger before it found her. While everyone else watched Kieran play, while guards stood at attention focused on external threats, Isolde's gaze caught on something wrong. A servant. Male, unfamiliar, moving through the crowd with a tray of wine. But his eyes weren't on the cups. They were locked on Kieran with an intensity that made Isolde's blood run cold. His hand drifted toward his belt, where the fabric hung strangely, weighted. Everything slowed down. The servant's fingers closed around something beneath his tunic. Kieran laughed, oblivious, running directly toward the man's position. The guards were looking the wrong direction. The warriors were drunk and distracted. Isolde didn't think. She moved. Lucian, blade. She was already out of her seat, already crossing the distance between the high table and the young prince. The servant's hand emerged holding a dagger, poisoned. She could smell it even from here, a sickly sweet scent that meant certain death. He lunged toward Kieran. Isolde crashed into the cub from the side, wrapping her arms around him and rolling them both away from the strike. The blade missed by inches, embedding itself in the wooden floor where Kieran had stood a heartbeat before. Chaos erupted. Lucian was a blur of lethal movement, his hand closing around the assassin's throat before anyone else could react. Warriors surged forward, weapons drawn. The music stopped. The celebration shattered into shouting and the metallic ring of steel being drawn. But Isolde barely registered any of it. She was curled around Kieran, her body once again a shield, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cub was crying, terrified but unharmed. Pressing his small white face against her shoulder. "I've got you," she whispered, the same words she'd said in that blood-stained clearing. "You're safe. I've got you." When she finally looked up, the entire hall was staring at her. And every single warrior had dropped to one knee. The coronation took place 3 days later, under the full moon. The fortress courtyard had been transformed into something between a sacred grove and a battlefield. Torches lined the stone walls, their flames dancing in the winter wind, while the pack gathered in a massive circle around the raised dais where the throne sat today. Warriors, healers, mothers, hunters, every member of Lucian's territory had come to witness this unprecedented moment. An Omega. A fragile, ethereal girl who couldn't lift a sword. Their Luna. Isolde stood before the throne in a gown of white and silver that seemed to capture moonlight itself, her pale hair braided with winter flowers and crystal beads. She no longer looked like the broken, terrified creature who'd hidden in corners. The fear hadn't entirely left her eyes, she suspected it never would, but it was tempered now by something else. Purpose. Belonging. The quiet knowledge that strength came in forms these warriors were only beginning to understand. Lucian stood beside her in full ceremonial armor, the crown of the Alpha King resting on his dark hair. But when he looked at her, all the iron melted away, leaving only the man who'd knelt on stone floors and tended her wounds with shaking hands. Isolde of no pack, his voice carried across the courtyard, formal and resonant, "You shed your blood to protect my bloodline. You stood when warriors would have fallen. You saw danger where trained eyes saw nothing." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with her delicate ones. "You are the bravest person I have ever known." He lifted the Luna's crown, silver wrought to look like winter branches, set with stones the color of ice and moonlight. "I claim you as my mate. My Luna. My queen." The crown settled onto her head with a weight that felt both terrifying and right. "Will you accept this claim? Will you stand beside me, not as a warrior, but as yourself?" Isolde's voice shook, but it carried. "I will." The pack erupted in howls that shook the stars. Lucian pulled her into a kiss that tasted like forever, like coming home, like every impossible thing she'd never dared to dream. When they finally broke apart, he guided her to the throne, not his seat, but hers, newly carved and placed beside his own. Isolde sat, and the white wolves appeared. All 5 spectral guardians materialized around the throne, their glowing eyes fixed on her with something like reverence. Fenris, the eldest, approached slowly and lowered his massive head to rest at her feet. The others followed, creating a living barrier of ancient magic around their chosen queen. The ethereal queen, they would call her in the stories to come. The girl too fragile to fight, too gentle to lead, who had proven that the fiercest strength was the courage to protect what you love. No matter the cost. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more werewolf romance tales, alpha kings, rejected mates, and powerful Omega stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of Isolde and Lucian's story and what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next. Your support means everything and helps me create more content like this. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next.